Greetings, friends. On this broadcast, we will talk in more detail about the Kharkiv, of course, direction with you. He studies in Yarskoy in more detail, as promised on the previous broadcast, Pokrovskaya, Kurakovskaya, and Kherson. We will also analyze an interesting and strange news background. I would call it strange, but obvious. Well, let's start in order. From the Kharkiv direction, fighting continues to varying degrees, some active, some positional. Enemy Drug, today they are compared to yesterday. Yesterday there were of course more Russian assault groups, today we observe more Drug. Attacks continue in the direction, including Volchansk. Well, now let's take it in order, in more detail. The Kharkiv direction section is the direction towards the settlement of Lipetsk, for which a lot of strikes are reported today. Indeed, there were a huge number of strikes on Volchansk from free-range rocket artillery, and by lunchtime, there were about 20 strikes with Volchansk air bombs, and about 12 from Lipsy. But this is by lunch, by the end of the day. Naturally we will have other figures already. There were official reports that there were battles in the area of the settlement of Olinikov, and these are already official reports. That's why we added a gray zone with you. The enemy from the settlement continues to attack dustily. The result of the fight is being clarified, because this is what happened after lunch in fact. It began mainly again with the reconnaissance of the Drug and small assault groups. As for the settlement itself, dusty, there are some details. On the part of the fighters of the 42nd Brigade, shots of strikes on the positions of Russian troops were published, that is, both in the southern part of the settlement of Dusty and on the exit in the direction of the settlement of Olinikov, where we added a gray zone. That is, the attacks shift Dusty. Is there any control established by the Russian side? So far, we are talking about small sabotage groups. Let's just say, as in the case of the RUD, we are leaving a gray zone for now, when there were raids in the Belgorod region. If the enemy manages to maintain control for about 24 and a little more hours, yes, then we move to the red zone. So far, there are active hostilities. At the same time, there were questions whether they were pulling up their reserves, not yet. Very high activity of sabotage and reconnaissance groups, let's say so frankly, experienced. Experienced, perhaps from other directions, is unknown. We are not going to talk about this now. We only say that they are acting. Well, of course they have gaps, but on the whole they work smoothly. Countermeasures for stabilization are being taken smoothly on the part of the armed forces of Ukraine. The site, we have already talked with you, is very complex, like a ledge. Firm the topographical component of how it restricts us. The enemy has a locality, that is, enough, where he can concentrate his forces and continue attacks. Therefore, it is too early to talk about stabilization. Plus, do not forget the superiority of tactical aviation bombs. This is now playing a very important role. The fighting continues. Now we are shifting to Volchansk. What is happening near Volchansk? Sabotage and reconnaissance groups attacked, and there were also reports from official representatives that there were battles for Ogurtsov. That is, Ogurtsov's Kadyshe. The fighting continues. Naturally, the impact shifts from the Pletonovka in the south direction, but not so much from the Pletonovka as from the Gothic. Attempts are being made, but we do not record any changes. There are a lot of throw-ins going on now, a huge amount. I'll tell you so, it's difficult to figure out where reliable information is, where misinformation is at the moment. On the Russian side, they publish, among other things, photo frames, when back in the 22nd year, they came in and captured Volchansk. Which means that in the spring they are spring shots, so they are already being given out as frames. So it means that the 24th allegedly year does not correspond to reality. I repeat, there is a lot of misinformation. On the part of the APU, shots of strikes were published on just the same Drug which tried to act under Volchansk. Therefore, so far we have no changes in the Volchansk direction, except that there are active hostilities for Ogurtsov. This is according to official reports. If not according to the official ones, then they continue for the Gothic as well. Well, again, a lot of misinformation. We turn to the Kapisko matchmaking site. Sinkovka, Kislovka without changes. Stelmakovka, we said a week ago that there would be activity today, we added a red zone. The enemy continues to change the attack vector, to probe therefore, in the direction of the Stelmakovka. The defense of the armed forces of Ukraine, and footage was published by the soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine. So they managed to knock out the tank, stop the enemy's attack. All this was just the same already within the gray zone. That is, before the attacks, we had everything that, let's say, the northeastern, not so much the eastern, northeastern Stelmakovka. Then the attack where we added a gray zone and shifted down. Now southeast of Stelmakovka, the main rolls are observed by the enemy in this direction. Therefore, the fighting continues with varying success. Somewhere it succeeds, somewhere, unfortunately, the enemy has advanced. But in principle, the tactics are similar to all other areas. This is a wide coverage, as you understand yourself. Therefore, the situation remains unchanged by the end of the day, but in fact, yes, including the Drug. Not only small assault groups are working from positions southwest of Novoselovsky, south of Novoselovsky, and actually eastern Myasozarovka. That is, they are trying to find a gap all over the site. The fighting continues. We are moving with you to the watch direction, where I spoke on the previous broadcast. We will dwell in more detail. We talked more about the southern part, south of the Golyubovsky to Stupki Reserve, but we start with the Sentinel Yar itself. Footage was published from the side of the AFU fighters, where strikes are being carried out on positions, already positions of Russian troops, on the territory of the Yar Dachas Clock. That is, the northern part of the canal area is the enemy is present. Well, in principle, we talked about a week and a half ago, somewhere so, for the attacks on the garage cooperative. So the first garages according to the footage from the APU drone were attacks by Russian troops. Then we added a red zone through the deciduous forest. There were also attacks and attempts to advance just the same into the territory of Dachas. Well, today we state that the enemy is approaching directly to the Yar itself, meaning from a different direction, not Zelenaya Street, where the fighting continues, but also the northern part of the canal district. Therefore, a gray zone has been added so far. Active hostilities continue because it is unknown whether Russian troops have gained a foothold on the territory of the Dacha or not. The fighting is going on. As for Zelenaya Street, shots were also published from the side of the AFU fighters, where strikes are being carried out approximately in the area of the gray zone. So, if we take into account the previous vector, as well as the Russian troops, it was from the deciduous forest. Again, it was possible to reflect on the building along Zelenaya Street then. Another attack is being observed, so the situation remains unchanged. But I would say that now they will put more emphasis, of course, on the dacha, on the railway. Why? Because this will give them a wide coverage, what they are fighting for very seriously, namely for attacks with a wide coverage, that is, getting positions thanks to which you can allow, given the tactics of small assault groups, you can allow them to attack with such a role. A fairly wide area. But you, in principle, already understand this yourself, from what we said on previous broadcasts. Therefore, it presses along the railway, and attempts to naturally enter the northern part of the canal district. We go further, the southern flank, the Golyubovsky to Mortar Reserve. It means that we have trenches along the forest belt, and shots were published from the AFU side, where strikes are being carried out on the positions and probable positions of the Russian troops, where they are moving. They are moving just the same from the reserve. We have talked with you about where this vector will be drawn. It will already be looked at in fact. So according to the changes, a gray zone has been added because there are active hostilities. So what did the enemy do? Before, as you remember, the attacks were on the reserve to the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal, where our pipes pass. They tried to catch on, to gain a foothold. They rejected the Viso, but we said that it is unknown to return to the original positions. Or there are positions somewhere in this area. So the vector changed a little, they went in the southern direction, respectively. There are trenches located here, and along them, they are already moving in the direction of the Ivanovo forest. It was possible, according to preliminary information from what we saw from the daytime footage, Yes, it was possible to stop. But we will look at what happens next. Because speaking in general, we observed some positionality for a long time. And although, taking into account the Russian troops already rolling into the Kharkiv region, offensive actions, there was some positionality. But later it very quickly turned into such attacks, that is, in small assault groups, as you noticed, in other areas. At the same time, yes, the number of air bomb attacks, as we mentioned, has decreased in a number of areas. It has naturally increased in the Kharkiv direction as a whole, but still. The enemy is currently active as much as possible on the entire front, so it is very difficult to fight it. A gray zone has been added, active hostilities continue. Vector, and so everything is the same. The canal and attempts to advance already to the Ivanovo forest. We move on with you further. Then to the Pokrov direction. Novo-Alexandrovka without changes. There were several attacks on Solovyev, including from the Berdik area. The fighters reported that they managed to knock out at least 5 armored vehicles, knock out, destroy, which means 1 MTELP. At least 2 tanks and 2 armored vehicles. Well, in general, this is what the day roll was. Managed to stop. And with you, a clarification is still to the east of Novopokrovsk. Adding it means that we talked about the site south of the southern forest belt, where we got hooked, so it looks something like this. There is still a question of a protrusion, but the enemy is now continuing, as you understand, now, today. And today continues its rolls, including with Berdik. There are attempts from Solovyev, but everything was stopped by Solovyev within the gray zone, so without significant changes. But active military operations are continuing in our country at this stage. Complex. Moving on. As you have noticed, the locality is not a tile on my screensaver, and some commented on it. I talked about it on the daytime broadcast. And I did not put a tile on it. Well, not really. We have a clarification on non-tiles. It means that fresh shots of the shelter behind the enemy's special warehouse, that is, a shelter with enemy personnel, have already been published by the AFU fighters. Artillery strikes were inflicted on the frames, but it means that we have added a red zone. Several positions are now being held with the enemy in the northern part of Ney Tailov, in the central, in its northern part. So the situation looks something like this. Therefore, the enemy continues to press, and fresh footage has been published, so in the area of farms. In other words, we said at the previous broadcast that there are 2 vectors, that is, they are moving in a northwesterly direction. That is what we have now added. Well, accordingly, the southwestern ones are already turning off and pressing on the territory of farms. Therefore, we continue active hostilities in Nontilovo itself. As in the Pervomaysky area, the enemy, having naturally obtained a number of positions between Pervomaysky and Novelsky, East Novelsky, Northeast Novelsky in the Kost area, will naturally undertake now along the Domaka beam to press in the direction of the supports in order to increase pressure from 2 directions already. Therefore, active hostilities continue, not Tailova, Pervomayskaya. There have been a lot of messages on Krasnogorovka during today, a lot of shots. But everything that has already been published in the afternoon is still within the red and gray zone. The enemy continues to press. There are heavy battles for the Krasnogorovsky refractory plant. Today, by the way, Russian media resources again claimed that they managed to take it completely, although such statements were received 2, 3, 5, and a week ago. Therefore, this is such a moment. The fighting continues, but it is clear that the enemy has superior forces here so far. Let's just say there is still hope to stabilize the situation in a number of areas. But everything will depend solely on how quickly the delivery of everything that the Western partners promised will work. That's how fast it will be delivered, including the ammunition needed, including the HIMARS systems, and to the HIMARS systems. Then we can talk. So far, it remains very difficult. The APU is fulfilling its task, so the fighting continues. Fighting also continues in Georgievka, but again they have a different degree of activity. Now they have grown into positionality. Well, most likely the enemy will again prepare again, I would say so, for activity, which we have been increasing and falling, as has been observed more than once in the Kurakovsky direction as a whole. Now they will pull up forces to Krasnogorsk-Ovka, as expected. And that's when they start storming Krasnogorsk refractory with large forces. There are still attempts to advance along Zheleznodorozhnaya Street, and to the south, so to the north of the forest belt. To advance along it, so, well, conditionally, they are aimed at this area approximately, yes. When they get a wide coverage, and naturally start their troops, additional reserves, then we will observe even more activity. Because they will need to disperse our forces as much as possible along the Kurakovsky direction. Therefore, the fighting continues to varying degrees. Moving on.